Welcome. We are really happy that all of you are here today. I'm Joyce Alfredink, and I'm a retired member of the Social Sciences Curriculum Committee. The committee is happy to bring you today's session. As always, we ask you to please take out your cell phones and make sure they're silenced so we don't detract from today's presentation. Thank you for doing that. Also, we welcome the crowd joining us via Zoom in the virtual classroom. Special thanks to our course technician, Mary Ellen Maiulo, for supporting our hybrid modality. If you have questions or comments to pose at the appropriate times, we kindly ask you to wait for the microphone so all participants can hear you. I have to do it, you do too. Last week, we connected with 4 incredible students currently living and studying in Lviv. Today's presenter, Robert Marco, is a retired professor and a former chair of the theology department at Aquinas College. He earned a master's degree in history and religion and a PhD in theology from Duquesne University. Dr. Marco has traveled to Ukraine numerous times, and in 2015, he was named a Fulbright U.S. scholar in his travels to Ukraine. It was for the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine. And that wasn't the only time. He's got a Fulbright scholarship a second time, which of course should make him happy and certainly made Aquinas College happy that he was able to get that. He's often describes himself as a utility infielder. Maybe he can share more, but I guess that means, and that was in theology, that it means that he is due to his eclectic interests and teaching, which includes urban studies and international relations. His PhD work focused on Catholic social teaching, especially on the relationship of religion, ethics, and society, and how Catholic social teaching can contribute to civil society in a post-Soviet and now post-Maidan period. Wow, that should be interesting. Today, in our final session together, he will expand upon the role of religion that is playing in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Wow. Help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Robert Marco.
Logically challenged. There it is. Actually, at my particular parish, I'm Roman Catholic. At the cathedral, we have these programs every once in a while for us more mature people, and the one they had on how to use an iPhone. I mean, it becomes that's not a joke. It's true. I mean, it's really true. I mean, I was amazed at how I'm not good, nor is my wife, but we were far superior to so many in there who didn't know anything, and I find I always struggle with that as I come down here. Thank you, Joyce, for your kind welcome. I didn't write that text. I don't know how they got it, but as personal introduction, I mean, pardon me, you Googled it. I must be a different fly. Okay, like Joyce, I've been to Ukraine about 9 times. 3 times I taught theology at the university, 2 on the government dime, which was really nice, and 1 I actually took a half cut in salary so I could spend a semester there. It was worth the experience of being in Ukraine, and it certainly has touched me in many ways. I don't know if any of you are Ukrainian descent. You are very good. Where from? Do you know?
Well,
okay. Yes. Stop. Oh, did you really? Okay, I'm from Pennsylvania originally. So you're from the eastern part of the state near Philly, or? Okay, yeah, it has a number of Ukrainians. It's interesting. I have a friend who's a Ukrainian priest, and he's actually from Pittsburgh. But Michael's family, they were all displaced. and many of them were workers during the Soviet during the Second World War. As you know, Ukrainians were often workers in Germany, and we can say more about that later. Any other thoughts or reflections before we begin? I'll just I certainly admire your interest in this topic. Yes.
Given the dual fronts that the U.S. is now addressing with respect to Ukraine, but also Israel.
Yeah.
And getting to the aspect of religion as to what role religion is playing in America's response, both politically and overall in terms of society.
Yeah, and I wonder how it is. I'm sort of suspicious sometimes of politicians, and they'll use it. I mean, let me be very candid about it. I think religion can be used, and we'll see this particularly in this crisis here, in this invasion. Religion is used by people. One of the claims is, and I'm fairly traditional, my own faith tradition. So I don't come as even though I was, I came to age during the sex, drugs, and rock and roll age, as you did too, but I still have maintained that kind of sensitivity to my tradition. But I often wonder, oftentimes, when people use religion, because it can be toxic and it can be polarizing. I was listening to a tape when I usually cut the grass or do gardening. I listen to tapes, and one of them was by an oblate spiritual writer who makes the claim that it's interesting. He'd rather live next to a convinced atheist than some hating Christians. So I think we live in a very difficult time. I think there's no question about it. And I think about my kids, my grandkids, etc. We live in a very difficult time in terms of religion and the role of religion. So we will address that up. Let me begin with a couple things here, and you probably know this as well as I do, and would pronounce it better than I. I started to study Ukrainian when I was 60, which is not a good time to start a language. I mean, they say it doesn't matter. I think it's a crock. I mean, it does matter. I have my buddy Victor Poletko lives in Leuven in Flemish Belgium. And he says that the in his house, the one that speaks Dutch the best, or Flemish, is 4-year-old Alexei. And meanwhile, he and his wife, they both have doctoral degrees and this and that. And he said that, but there's something about it that it sticks earlier, I think, when you're than it does when you're older. But let me begin by saying this: the national hymn, and I'll try to focus using a text and then going back and forth. And I'll say this again, one of the things, please feel free, we'll have a break. I was at a presentation for West Ulsters at where I live in Grand Rapids, and the guy went on for an hour and a half, and there was no potty break or whatever. And at a stage, I can't get through the night. I mean, as some of the men will probably identify, but we will do that, and we will break, and we'll try to keep this as informal as possible, because I think in many ways it's an encounter, right? And I say this, and it's not a gratuitous comment or BS comment. I've learned more from my students than you can imagine. I probably learned more from my students than I have from my colleagues, because I probably like them better. But I've learned more from my students than one could imagine. And I found that experience very much in Ukraine, and I'll say more about it. Some of what I'll say, therefore, has been touched, is sort of anecdotal, because when I'm talking about this issue, I'm always online. I'm online every week with people, one in Belgium, one in Poland, one right now. I work with a group called Teachers for Ukrainians, and it's run by a woman of Bulgarian descent, the Bulgarian immigrant in Canada, which has people like you and I volunteer to help young people with English, and older people, with English, as they need it, particularly in light of the current situation. In any event, let us begin. The national hymn of Ukraine begins with this: She ne vila Ukraini ni slava ni boya. Literally, it means neither the glory nor the will of Ukraine has died, or as my Ukrainian friends often have said, and as a joke, because they have great sense of humor, Ukrainians generally do, is Ukraine is not dead yet. That resilience, I think, is very much found in the defense of their freedom and life, particularly in light of the current invasion by Putin. The role of religion is certainly a burning one. Last week, I received the invitation to come here because the original person could not attend these 4 sessions. So I received that invitation, but at the same time, I received 2 emails specifying certain things that were going on in Ukraine. Let me quote one, and this was from a news source called Zenit, probably pretty accurate. There were a couple disparaging remarks and I kind of disregarded. So when they refer to Moscow and they use the big Z, which is not in either the Russian alphabet or the Ukrainian alphabet, but they use that in terms of a kind of already a political statement about the situation. All right, let me quote a couple things here. After the Rada, or the parliament of the Ukrainians is located in Kiev. I say Kiev. Normally, the Russian way of describing it is Kiev. And today on the news, you see the word Kiev. That's what's normally the case. So I pick up my granddaughter after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays yesterday, and she was talking about, she said Kiev, which is kind of the way we normally speak now in order to avoid either Kiev or cave. So there are different pronunciations. Actually, this is an aside, but I think significant is that Ukrainian language and Russian language are not as similar as people think. In many ways, some of the other Slavic languages, like Serbian, and also a language like even Slovak and Polish, are much more similar, despite Slovak and Polish using the Latin alphabet rather than the Cyrillic alphabet. I mean, they're not as similar as one may think. All right, after the Rada or Kiev's parliament voted in recent days for a ban on Ukraine on the activities of the jurisdiction of the Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. Do you have a general sense of how the whole Orthodox world worked in Ukraine? Does anybody have any idea of how this? You have all these different groups, and I'll say more about this later. In 2019, there's a church that became the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which was really a merger of a couple different Orthodox groups in Ukraine. All right, so let me suggest this, and I'll give you a history of how this all happened in a bit. But what happened is you have jurisdictional conflicts. I know this would not happen among Catholics or Calvinists, that you didn't always agree, but I mean you have certainly jurisdictional conflicts and this and that, and the history of it actually is fascinating. It's actually a pretty fascinating history. All right, they voted. The head of the Moscow Patriarchy, Kirill, as you know, launched a heartfelt appeal, and I'm going to quote this, to all the heads of the local Orthodox churches, that's the whole world, all right, and to a series of other religious leaders around the world to intervene in support of the Orthodox faithful. Those are quotes from his words. Intervene in support of the Orthodox faithful, without receiving any declaration or promise of help. Nobody responded to Kirill's plea for support. What was the reason for this? What was the problem? The problem was that the Rada in Kiev decided that it talked about outlawing the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. My personal opinion, that's a bad move. But there have been arguments of that because oftentimes there are many spies in that group, and they've been somewhat disruptive of the Ukrainian self-defense. So I'll say more about that in a minute. Moreover, even the spiritual head of the church, Metropolitan Onufri did not respond given the painful situation he's in. So in the system, and I'll talk about how this historically came to be, because that's an important consideration. In the system, what you have is a Moscow Patriarchate, and the Moscow has a metropolitan, like kind of like archbishop in certain areas of Ukraine. Certainly in the mainland, you have one. The biggest one would be the head who's located in Kiev, and then you also have metropolitans in places like Odessa and places like that. So you have the kind of system, of a system where you have heads of churches in particular geographic areas, but they're all under Moscow. Okay, so he did not respond. I was talking on Sunday with a young man who's American actually, and we were talking about the situation there. And he suggested to me that Onufri's trying to probably balance, or he may be just double speak, say one thing to another. He's in a very bad situation. So it's whether he's right about this or not, I'm not sure. What Brian's analysis was, it's a difficult situation, and as the metropolitan of a church located in Moscow, as a metropolitan of church, he's being very, very careful what he has to say. But as you know, I mean, there has been some concern about Moscow Patriarchate's priests and monks. It's kind of not just supporting Putin, but also leading causes of reporting people who are opposed to the Russian forces in certain places like Bucha, and I'll say more about that in a minute. All right. Many Ukrainian priests also in the Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchy, have stopped commemorating the Moscow Patriarch in their liturgy. In the liturgy of the Eastern Church, and you find this in the Ukrainian Church, I don't know if you find it anyplace else. I mean, in American system, we don't do that much. There's a commemoration. We remember Kirill, the Patriarch, His All Holiness of Moscow. The Roman Church does some of that in their canon. So they'll talk about, we'll talk about the Pope in communion with the Pope of Rome, or, Francis and Bishop David, our bishop, but you don't probably find that in most traditions, I suspect, right? You don't mention leaders, do you? The head of the Sunday school committee or something. I don't know what they do. I mean, who knows? But I'm not aware of that. In any event, Putin has used certainly the Orthodox Church to support the invasion. That seems to be one of the questions that Ian suggested that we address, and I will address that, I hope. And the second kind of question is how has religion shaped? This is what Ian said to me from your group. How has the religion in Ukraine shaped national identity? I don't know if any of you asked that question, but how has it? And I'll kind of address that also. And thirdly, what role might religion play in a new Ukraine once the war is over? And I would argue, and I'll say this more formally, using a text, I would argue that religion has already been playing a very important ecumenical development of solidarity, development of a civil society in Ukraine, even within the last 20 years or so. Ukraine becomes independent from the breakup of the Soviet Union, so it becomes independent in 1991. And since that time, religion has played a very, very significant role, I think, in the life of the people. And unlike places where there's more tension between religious traditions, in Ukraine, surprisingly, there isn't. I don't know if your experience was there, but people of different religious traditions have a much more hospitable attitude towards each other than I oftentimes find in the United States. I've been listening to this A Fever in the Heartland. I'm familiar with that book. It deals with the Ku Klux Klan. My wife recommended it. And it's interesting. I only finished half of it, but it's interesting how religion became such a negative, we had such a negative role in supporting anti-Semitism, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-everybody in Indiana and other places, right? I mean, it's amazing how one oftentimes would be shocked by that. All right. So let me turn to the historical context. Ukraine has a long Christian tradition dating back to the 10th century. Does anybody recall or know how this whole thing happened? Did you do any of this in the first two sessions? No. Or you have a figure of Volodymyr the Great, Vladimir Veliki, who is who kind of is the person that brings Christianity to Ukraine, to Kiev. They make claims, and the Ukrainians make claims that Saint Andrew visited Kiev, and you got a statue of Saint Andrew up in Kiev in the city. Have you seen that? There's a statue of. If you've been to Kiev, yeah, there's a statue of Saint Andrew up there. They claim that he visited. You know, that it's great history, but probably not great story, but maybe not accurate history. All right. Vladimir himself was baptized in Crimea. All right. So he was baptized in Crimea. He got this religion. He brings it back to Ukraine, and he himself, with the clergy from from Constantinople, baptized the nation. You have these images of Vladimir in the river baptizing everybody. You know, it's a very much of a significant piece where you have this kind of image, and they kind of romanticize it. There's all kind of stories told. When I was a grad student in history at the University of Pittsburgh. Yeah. Can you hear me? All right. You can hear me. Can they hear me? Whatever. No. Did I do? All right. It has to be this way. So I told you I'm technologically challenged. That's not a joke. All right. I remember reading and doing a paper on what was called the Russian Primary Chronicle, written by a man named Nestor, and he talks about how Vladimir searched all the religions, and he saw this and this and this. He saw the West, you know. At that time this is pre-Reformation time. You know, there's the Catholic Church in the West, and he sees Muslims and he sees Jews, and there's a lot of reasons he doesn't go those directions, but the chronicler says that when he saw the liturgy in Byzantium and Constantinople, he didn't know whether he was on heaven or on earth. It was so beautiful. And one of the factors is, and I think this is again anecdotal, but I think one of the factors why people are somehow moved to embrace the East is because of more of a mystical experience. You understand what I'm saying? So you have people that, you got people with, Van such and such, who becomes a pastor of a local Antiochian Orthodox church. You have people who embrace it because there's something about the mystical experience that certainly gives some validity to the story, whether it all happened the way it did of the conversion of Kiev Rus. All right. In any event, there are probably 222,000 religious communities in Ukraine from about 80 different Christian denominations, as well as other religions. Many in Ukraine are somewhat unchurched, even if they live in a predominantly Orthodox environment like the eastern part of Ukraine, but they're pretty much unchurched. One of the things that struck me when I first went there was a number of American missionaries that went to the Ukraine. They're always having missionaries. I don't know if you find that. I mean, they have, Lviv has a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. All right. Generally, they move in with people who have some bucks, but they're alone, and they oftentimes become inheritors of the houses, and that's the Ukrainian story. So we have throughout Ukraine, you have a lot of religious traditions that are very dominant. All right, in 988, Volodymyr the Great establishes Christianity. This happens before there's a split between East and West in 1054. The Great Schism. And the Kievan Church was interesting. Kievan Church continued in many ways to be in some relationship with the West. And this is also true in some of the other areas and some of the Balkan areas. So you have people going into the area and into the area who'd serve as missionaries in Orthodox countries to Orthodox congregations who came from the West. And you had that kind of phenomenon going on. All right. The church split in 1054, as you know. But the reality is it's more complicated than we think. It's like Orthodox, Catholic, whatever this, and then later on, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant. My grandmother was born in what is now Slovakia. It used to be when she came over. Both her husband came over and she came over, when it was still Austria-Hungary. And I remember an aunt of my aunt, so she'd be a great aunt, making comments about in the particular village in which they came from. You had a strong presence of Slovakia was generally Roman Catholic, but you had a lot of what they call Greek Catholics in communion with Rome, but follow the Eastern tradition. You also had a number of Orthodox who are not in communion with Rome. And you had, like my grandmother and grandfather, they were Lutheran. And you also had Hungarian Reformed. They're all in the same village. I mean, the picture is not as simplistic as I think you're given, right? You got Orthodox Ukraine. Well, maybe not. I mean, I'll say more about this. The Rome and Constantinople had their disputes, as you know. In 1054, there's a split. The Kievan Patriarchy tried to work for Christian unity. It tried to see itself as kind of, this is the borderland. This is, the famous phrase that Snyder has popularized, Timothy Snyder. Has anyone read Snyder's stuff on Ukraine? It's great. It's really good. He's really good. Snyder talks about the borderland. It's the borderland between East and West, they would say, right? Now, this is a very significant kind of piece where you have some kind of relationship between the different religious traditions there. All right. I'm not going to talk much about this, but what happened for my particular purposes is to talk about one of the major denominations there, which is Ukrainian Greek Catholic, which have about 4 to 5 million people in their congregants in their church. And that particular group comes out and becomes a reality not until the Union of Brest in 1596. But it's a pretty dominant presence in Ukraine. It's one of the many religious traditions that are present in Ukraine. There are a lot of them. And it comes into existence in 1596. The area south of there, in Uzhhorod Makachevo, interesting enough, comes into communion with Rome in 1648. So you have a split in 1054, but it's not a final split. And certain people then migrate back into communion with Rome, but keep their own particular customs. All right. I was mentioned, yes.
Well, the people that I met there did not talk about which, part of the church, which group they were with.
Okay.
I know there was a lot from the East and the Ukrainian Orthodox, but what you're saying about missionaries coming there, when I met these people and heard them express their religious beliefs, I felt like they should be sending missionaries to America.
It's interesting. Yeah, there's a very different tone, and I'll say a little bit more later about them, but there's a very different tone in terms of it. There's a higher acceptance level than you would think. There's one of the kids that when I was there in 208, I think it was, on 215, I forget what years, maybe 215. Artem's grandpap was a Baptist pastor. There are a lot of Baptists in Ukraine. I'll say more about the number. It's a lot of Baptists in Ukraine, particularly in Eastern Ukraine. All right. That's that very clear presence of Baptists there. He himself's dad now became Pentecostal, kind of Assembly of God, Pentecostal. And he himself was studying to be a Pentecostal minister. So we had dinner. He went to the Catholic University, the Ukrainian Catholic University, interesting enough. But and that his religious affiliation aside, that was not an issue. Whatever what he was, I would joke because the people I know who are evangelical or Protestant are much better Christians, and I would tease all of them and say, you know what? Unlike the Greek Catholics and Orthodox, you guys don't get drunk and fornicate every night. And then he retorted to me. He said, "Yeah, but every other night." I was a joke. But in other words, you'll find a very strong presence, and you'll find a strong Christian presence in particularly. This was true in the East. But then what began to happen? So the western part of Ukraine is kind of mixed, and I'll say more about it. You got Polish Catholics, you got some Armenians. You got Greek Catholics, and you got Orthodox of the various types. All right, let me say something more about this then. All right, it wasn't until 1696 that the Kievan Patriarchate, fell under the authority of Moscow. So Moscow, during the time in which Constantinople was being afflicted by Turkey, that's there, I know it's part of Turkey and everything else, was being afflicted by religions in Turkey and Islam. You have authority given to Moscow. So you're talking about 17th century. Moscow then becomes dominant. Before that time, the area that was dominant was Kiev or Kiev or Kiev. That was a dominant area. The church was Kievan Rus. It was from that area. But eventually, Moscow, which had been more in the hinterlands, and there's historical data, and you've probably heard this already about how that area developed. But Moscow, which was in kind of the wilderness, then becomes a more dominant city and a bigger city, and then becomes the head of the Ukrainian church. So then what we call Western and Central Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine geographically then are under Moscow. I think that's a key element. So therefore, when Kirill wants to go back and say that we want to go back to this Ruski Mir, the Russian peace, because that's all of these lands belong to us, not just religiously, but in reality, there is no such thing as really Ukrainians. I mean, the argument is they're not Ukrainians. They're all Russians. It's interesting. You have Ukrainians were often called white Russians. They were white Russians. And then what you also have, interesting enough, is the area of Belarus, right? You got little Russians, you got white Russians. All those areas are considered to be part of the empire, right? So you got this Belarus. Belarus literally is white Russian, whereas Ukrainians were called little Russians. Situations are a little bit complicated. All right. 20th century was very bad in Ukraine. I'll just go through this quickly. There was certainly they went through the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I. We're told this by the previous presenter. Western Ukraine fell under Poland. So in 1919, Western Ukraine becomes part of Poland. Lviv becomes Lvov, with the Polish W, which is the V sound, I guess. Lviv becomes Lvov, and that lasts all the way through to the beginning of World War II. And then when Germany invades Poland, you have that famous pact between Stalin and Hitler, and the area that was Lviv then area around first of all becomes part of the Soviet, then the Nazis, then the Soviets again. It's a whole mess. You have this whole movement in that area, in which different groups are fighting over the land. Interesting comment I've heard from some Ukrainians. I don't know if you would say this, but some Ukrainians would therefore they prefer the Germans to the Russians. So you got the kind of, yeah, you've heard that too. Yeah, they said, and I've heard it from Latvians, the same thing. They prefer that if I have a choice between the Germans and the Russians, I'll take the Germans. All right, the invasion at the beginning of the war was followed by German occupation. The Russia moves in, then German occupies it to 44, and the end of the war, it becomes definitively part of the Soviet Union. Believers began to be cruelly persecuted, and in 1946, what was called the major church in Lviv area is what they call the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was suppressed. Christianity was illegal. God was banished, and there was any kind of moral law became a situation in which that became non-existent. So you have this happen after the Soviet takeover. During this period, the Greek Catholic Church in Halicia or Halich was led by a very significant man that I'm going to talk about a little bit in terms of his own vision, Metropolitan Andrei Sheptypsky. He was head of that church from 1901 to 1944. He was a spiritual leader at this time. Sheptypsky's interesting. His father was a Polish. His father was Ukrainian, but in the Polish nobility. You know, who's Polish, who's Ukrainian? You know, it's murky. Let me say this. I know students, for example, now who have at least 1/4 Polish. This is in the last 20 years, could all go to school for free in Poland because the area is so diverse. 1939, for example, in 1939. Lviv was 50% in Polish population, 30% Jewish, strong Jewish population, and only 20% Ukrainian. Most of the Ukrainians lived in the rural land. Ukrainians were the farmers, what you technically would call the peasants, whereas in the city itself, there was a strong Polish element, and there still is. But the numbers have gone down substantially because after World War II, as you may know, Soviets began to displace populations. So people from Ukraine who were Polish descent had to go to Poland. People in Poland of Ukrainian descent, or what they would think would be Russian descent, came back into the land of Ukraine. Very, very interesting kind of history. I just am always amazed when I'm in Lviv to see the diversity of the city. I don't know if you noticed this too. You were in Lviv, right? Briefly, but you know, you'll notice you have architecture from the Italian period. You got architecture from the Austro-Hungarian period, which is pretty nice. You got Polish buildings, huh? Then you got these god-awful Soviet buildings, which are these huge apartment buildings that go up and up and up. They're the most ugly. They have absolutely no taste. I mean, they have absolutely no taste. But but the city is so diverse. The image that people have is, well, you know, it's all this way or that way. Well, it isn't. Okay. Yeah. No, Ukrainians are Greek Catholic. They call them Ukraine. They call it UGCC, Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, right? Yeah. There isn't. There are Greek Catholics who are not. There are other groups that are not under the Ukrainian Church who we would call Greek Catholic. I grew up in an area of Pittsburgh where everybody was either Jewish. The area I grew up in was a town called Braddock, which is a steel town, and probably the most devastating places in the country now. And where there's very strong Jewish population, we had what they called the Greek Catholic Church. It basically is a Ruthenian church, the eastern part of now Slovakia, and that was called the Greek Catholic Church. So that was where we go there. My mother was Irish Catholic. My dad was a non-practicing Slovak Lutheran. And if we missed church, or I went to my Bubba's church, which was the Lutheran church, my mother made sure we had went to mass too, that way,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna go to hell. All right, or she worried out, in other words, so we had to go to mass, and sometimes you go to the Ruthenian church because it was the latest one and she didn't like to get up. So I went with my Bubba to Lutheran church, St. Paul's, and the reality of the fact, you'd go in there and the liturgy was in Old Church Slavonic. Old Church Slavonic, which they still use in some of the Slavic churches. Ukrainians tended to use after Vatican II, they tended to use the Ukrainian language. All right. But not all churches did. Some wanted to go back to that kind of
Yeah,
system.
the reason, well, the question again, to repeat for those who wasn't talking to online, is that whether there's a distinction between Greek Catholic and Ukrainian Catholic. And this comes up with me because my mother, she was born in Lviv, when it was part of Poland, kept calling the church, our home church in Chicago, where we finally settled, St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic.
I know it. I've been there often.
And
Know it.
she called us Greek Catholics.
Yeah, and they did.
And I
They
said,
did
"No,
do that.
We're Ukrainian Catholics." We had this debate going back.
Yeah, they did that, and it becomes really problematic. And the Ukrainian church is a church that's more universal than you think, and people are attracted to it are not necessarily Slavic. But they would always call, and that was the way they did it. And in Chicago, we were talking about shows of diversity here. In Chicago, you got Saint Volodymyr on Ohaz, which is 1 block away. In that church, they're a different calendar. That church was founded in the 1950s by a man who was in Rome 60s, I guess, because was Joseph Shapli, who was released after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he was in the Gulag, and then he came back, and they wouldn't let him go back in Ukraine because the church was illegal. So what Shapli had to do was he went to Rome. He was a real character. A lot of the clergy in that tradition, I don't know if that's true of your traditions, but a lot of the clergy were real characters. Kind of one, so he set up, there were churches under his jurisdiction in America that went by the old calendar, as you used to say, right? The old calendar, the Julian calendar, and that Saint Olha and Volodymyr were on different time schedule, liturgical schedule than Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas was under, was under the Rome, but it didn't have that Ukrainian flair that a metropolitan, or they used to call him patriarch, even though technically he's not a patriarch. Patriarch, we can say more about that later, but he's not technically, he's a major archbishop, but they called him Patriarch Joseph. And that became under his jurisdiction, these churches. So he sent over people from the old country, and when they came to America, they kept the old customs. Yeah, but there is also a Greek Catholic church in Greece. And the term Greek Catholic oftentimes can also mean Malkites, Arabs. You have a whole... You kind of miss that in Grand Rapids and Holland area. You'd find that very clear in Detroit and Chicago, right? You go to Detroit, you just look at the different domes, huh? You don't know, and it takes a while to figure out who's on first. Believe me, it took me 6 months to get. I'm serious, because it gets very, very, very confusing. Good question. All right, during the period the war and tragedy of the 20th century. In any event, even the activities of in Russia itself, the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church was very limited. You know what happened after the Bolshevik Revolution? The Patriarchate is gone, and it isn't reinitiated until 1940s under Stalin. Why? Why would Stalin want to be an Orthodox patriarch? He was an ex-seminarian. Yeah, by the way, Stalin was an ex-seminarian from Georgia, Russian from Georgia, ex-seminarian, and he was an atheist. But why would he do that? What do you think? Exactly, he wanted the support. So what happened is that Patriarchate then comes back into it's suppressed all those years. And then During World War II, what happens is Stalin reinitiates the Moscow Patriarchate. Okay. Nevertheless, suppression has, I don't want to romanticize Ukraine. Maybe we both will do this, but I don't want to romanticize it because there are serious problems even since 1991 when it's declared free. And there are serious problems in Ukraine. I think the biggest problem is corruption. I mean, that seems to be the case. I was on the phone last Thursday. I spent one Thursday mornings with this guy, Maxim, from near Cave. And we were talking, and I said, I keep on, when I'm with him on the phone, I'm laughing all the time to tell stories. I said, there's corruption in Ukraine, right? He said, yeah, my dad said that, my grandpap said that. All right, whatever. And I know it. And one of the jokes is, I said, you can always bribe your way out of a bad situation. And it's true. I mean, the police are corrupt. And the story is that the priests make the police make 5,000 hryvnias. Hryvnias is the money thing. It's not worth much, believe me. And it's gone down and down and down per month, or 3,000 hryvnias a day, which is 3 times, whatever. I mean, 6,000 or whatever, because corruption is so. Courts are corrupt. They haven't maybe straightened out. Businesses are corrupt. I'm part of that was what happened in the Soviet system. This image, and I'm not arguing for a libertarian or praising unbridled free market system. But what happened under Soviet society was, if everything is controlled by the state, if you control everything by the state, there are going to be problems. What happens then is not that you have a sense of solidarity with one another, but what happens is you're going to take care of yourself. All right, let me read you what Sebchuk says here. This is from a book that I got recently, and this is what Svetoslav Sebchuk says. I'll just read you this. Second, in the Soviet era, the importance of the collective was emphasized. There's no question about it. Ukraine suffered in 1931-32 what was known as a Holodomor. You ever heard of that? For Ukrainians, it was worse than the Shoah. They exaggerate the numbers. They said, well, only 6 million Jews died and we lost 10 million. Well, it's not the case. They lost about a million or so, right? Were killed. The Holodomor was that forced famine by Stalin, right? In any event, so you got this kind of sense, that because, and the reason they had a forced famine, because unlike Soviet workers, Ukrainians tended to be very, very independent farmers. All right. They were not going to be kulaks. They were going to be or kulaks was the negative term, rather. Kulaks was kind of this independent farmer who takes care of himself. All right. So the system was everybody works on collective farms. That was the issue. All right, okay. So to give you a context of that, according to state programs, there's a program called of collectivization. So you're deprived of all your personal belongings, especially in the villages and in the land. All animals, all beings were supposed to be common for everyone. This emphasis of a common in a post-Soviet society led to an opposite effect. Everybody was thinking only about his own deal, so that collectivization in the past provoked some sort of an extreme individualism. Do you hear that? And I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? It's interesting when I was in Lviv, and one of the things I found there is everybody wanted to be a capitalist. And one of the most popular works was all the works of Ayn Rand. Atlas Shrugged. Remember Ayn Rand stuff? Everybody thought they were going to make it. Well, they didn't make it because all the people who were Soviet officials in Ukraine got all the money anyway, right? And the court system was clearly corrupt. and there were attempts to kind of clean it up. Where there was an American ambassador, I don't know if it was Yovanovitch might have been very helpful in correcting some of the things. She was American ambassador to Ukraine. Some of you may remember. And there was an American or Canadian who became finance minister, and it was an impossible situation. So what happened is, rather than producing this sense of solidarity, we're in this together, the sense of community, what you had basically was just the opposite. Totalitarianism then produced a kind of radical individualism, right? Collectivism, which was not the intent of collectivism, but it produced a radical kind of individuality. Let me continue, and then we should break. All right. All right. I'd like to look, secondly, and we'll do this at religion in Ukraine in terms of two people. Let's break. How much time do you need? Do you ready to break now, or do you want to wait, or 5-10 minutes? What do you need? What do you guys need? Whatever. What do you think? What's your sense? 5 minutes is good. Yes, do that. Okay. All right. There's only one. There's one men's room down there. I don't know about the ladies' room. I suspect is. I don't know that. You know, the women will be in it anyway because they can't get in the ladies' room. So, all right. There's one upstairs. Good. So how do you wind? How'd you wind up in this area? If you came from Chicago? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I know. Yeah. I know. Let's turn this off. And
Does anybody have a burning question you'd like to start out with? Because I'll give you the microphone. No burning questions. I have a question about the corruption. Maybe you could continue with that discussion, because I have a discussion pretty much weekly online with some Ukrainian students and a couple of teachers. And something they said recently bothered me, because I feel like Zelensky is doing a fabulous job. And the teachers at least, were not impressed. And they felt that the aid that they are given from other countries, including ours, may not have been used as wisely as it could have. So they were
Yeah, and
the
you know, that's beyond
possibility of
my
corruption.
expertise. People are going to claim that too. There is corruption there. I mean, I don't know. Zelensky, the president, right? People familiar there. If you ever, this is on YouTube and probably in maybe other places. He's part of he was a comedian, secular Jew comedian. All right. Okay. Pretty. There's a series he did called Servant of the People, or Servant of the Nation, depending upon how you want to translate it, which dealt specifically with a guy who is some school teacher. His life's going apart. He and his wife are divorcing. He lives with his mother and his sister and his father. And the kids in the class decide, this is a high school class, or they oftentimes called Lyceum over there, put his name in for president. He gets elected president of Ukraine. It's really funny. I don't know if has anyone seen that Servants. You can find it. I think it's hilarious. The language is one of the reasons I watched it, and I watched the whole thing in Ukraine, is I wanted to improve my language, but they use that Surgic, which is kind of a combination Russian Ukrainian. So you don't hear pure Ukrainian. And for somebody like me who has a hard time, I can't even read English phonics. Well, I mean, I had it in school, but I find it problematic. But it's also dubbed in English, It is really, really funny. If you have a sick sense of humor, as my children would testify, I do. And I really, it's hilarious. I would recommend it. I'm not sure that I heard there was some issues there. You know, there's been a really difficult history between the U.S. and Ukraine. When Yovanovitch was here, who was the American ambassador in Kiev, she was here a couple years. It was last year. I remember going to see her, and she wrote a book on. I forget the name of the book. I got it from one of my sons, which deals specifically with her experience with the government here. And I think, you know, look, I think Marx is certainly right about this. Suspect your hermeneutic. We all have our own interpretation. And so when I hear that, I have to say, well, what is the agenda of this particular person? Is there probably some corruption? I suspect there is. But you got, on the other hand, you got both presidential candidates in the last election had a son who was accused of some kind of hanky-panky there, right? Well, the Biden and Trump, they're all in the same, I mean, they're all in the same boat in a certain way. You know what I mean? I tend to be very critical of, this is me, but I tend to be very critical. My wife and I go off on this off time, but she tends to be this is it, and this is it, and this is the way it is. I said, I don't know. I say, the older I get, the more I say, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, is there corruption? Probably. Yeah. Is it, what does that mean? Is there corruption everywhere? There's corruption everywhere, for gosh sake, you know. Someone I have a brother-in-law who loves that Joel Osteen. I'm not knocking religion, but, you know, and somebody else put on her, you know, he got this house and that house and this land and, you know, whatever. You got religious leaders who are really corrupt, right? You know, West Michigan's the home of Jimmy Baker, right? All right, okay. All right. So, you know, is there corruption? Maybe there is with some people. You know, I don't know. Yeah, it's a very good question. All right. I was asked over here about Timothy Snyder. So thank you for bringing this up to me. But here's a very interesting book on the area of Ukraine and Poland and Belarus between the wars. It's called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. I trust Snyder. You do too. He's also written a book that's pretty academic called The Reconstruction of Nations, which deals with Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania. Because you'll see historically all of these, and you know this from the last sessions, all of this was together, right? Ukraine and, Western Ukraine was part, and even most of Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? I mean, you know that. I mean, I'll say more about my own experience in Lviv. I'm sorry, I'm not sticking to a text. I'd be clearer then maybe, but I know when I would go to the Roman Church. My tradition is Roman Catholic. I go to the Roman Church as well as Ukrainian Geek Church often. I'd go to both, and in the Roman Church, the Lviv is a pretty cosmopolitan city. I've been there one day, but it's very cosmopolitan. It's been called the Babylonia of the West or something, and the congregation included some Western Europeans, but a lot of Africans. So we're at liturgy, and I haven't heard Kumbaya since I was a kid. And they sing Kumbaya because the Africans get in there and it's sing Kumbaya, and it's the liturgy in the English liturgy. The Polish liturgies to me is like, oh my God, I'm looking for Latin so I can understand what they're doing. But it's very, very much more diverse than people would think it is. And I just want to say that. Okay, let me look at two people, and then we're gonna I'm going to share a handout with you and stuff. In Ukraine, despite the majority number of nominal Orthodox, there is religious diversity. I emphasize nominal as Belarus's president, Alexei Lukashenko, calls himself Orthodox, but he's an atheist. All right. I mean, I'm not contradictory, I think, right? All right. Could be a problem, but there's been some research done on what's happened since the war and the conflicts by a woman by the name of Catherine Weiner. She teaches at Penn State University in Pennsylvania, And she says that what is occurring in Ukraine is what we call people call just Orthodox. They may be somewhat similar to the nuns in America. You know that term, right? Religiously, N-O-N-E-S, all right. All right. That there is they say they're Orthodox, but well, they're not going to argue about stuff, right? So they're Orthodox, but so that's an increasing number of people. I know some young people that are that way, but the one in Western Ukraine, not too many, but there are some. So you have this kind of nuns, that all right. Okay. The Ukrainian traditional churches include, of course, the Moscow Patriarchate Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And since 1919, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, OCU. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is UOC. That church itself was formed by certain non-Russian Orthodox clergy and people and traditions. One time there were three major Orthodox churches in Ukraine. I don't want to belabor this, but I'll just tell you. There was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow. Then there was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, KP, Cave and Patriarchate. Some guy said after the breakup of the Union, this guy decided that he'd have his own church, and a number of Orthodox went with him. All right. And then there was a church that was already around in the early part of the 20th century called the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. That was centered oftentimes in the West also. The West tends to be more religious, generally than Russia. I mean, Russia, and despite the claimer of traditional values, why some people criticize Zelensky. I don't think it's anti-Semitism, but criticize Zelensky as being secular, Ukraine being secular, and they talk about traditional values. You probably have heard this, right? We have this whole notion of traditional values, and therefore the West, some people that are critical of Ukraine and any support of Ukraine want to support traditional values. And yet in reality, I mean, if you're talking about traditional values, Russia was one of the first states to legalize abortion. Divorce rate is off the wall. I mean, in other words, these are not they're traditional, what you'd call traditional values. All right. But what you have then is a very, very interesting situation where a group of these Ukrainian Orthodox got together in 2018, and with Poroshenko, who was president, petitioned the Bartholomew, the Patriarch of Constantinople, right? You're familiar with Bartholomew, you know the name, all right, okay. But Bartholomew was the Patriarch of Constantinople, which now is in Turkey, as you know, for autocephalous status. So in 2019, you have this the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, OCU. Very, very important group, and that certainly contains much of the population, including some ex-Russian Orthodox congregants. And particularly since the war, things have changed. I think that's important to say. Things have changed. All right. You also have an Armenian community in Lviv. There's an Armenian cathedral. It used to be under Rome, and now it's separate, part of the Armenian church, separate from Rome. There's a Polish cathedral, Roman Catholic, and there is a Ukrainian Greek Catholic cathedral there called St. Yuri. So you have a strong presence of Armenians, Lutherans, some Calvinists, Baptists, Pentecostals, Seventh-day Adventists, who are all over the world. They're one of the most dominant religions. I didn't realize that. They're one of the most worldwide religious traditions in the world. I didn't know that. Did you know that? I know if you've seen anything on Rwanda, they were the people that stayed. The Adventists stayed with the people while everybody else got out. All the other missionaries got out. The Belgian troops got out. Everybody got out during the Rwandan massacre. But the Adventists have a strong presence there. And unlike the World Council of Churches, and the National Council of Churches. The religious organizations in Ukraine consist of not just Christians, but non-Christian traditions. You know, World Council of Churches, Russia belonged, and some of the Soviets belonged, not because they buyed liberal Protestantism of that era, which they became known for that, because they were very traditional and they thought that they were all going to hell anyway. But they, what they did was because of political reasons. So you have the World Council of Churches, just Christian denominations, right? Certain denominations, even who would call themselves Christians, aren't even belong to that. The National Council of Churches includes essentially Protestants, right? I don't know. Is RCA in the National Council of Churches? Do you know? I don't know. Huh? You okay? So you have. I mean, I you don't know that. So they include the Ukrainian organization includes the All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organization, which encompasses 90% of the religious communities in Ukraine. I mentioned already that I think my experience is that some of the most faithful and serious Christians you'll find are part of the evangelical movement. A lot of them had to get out because a lot of them were in the East. They're the Donbass region. There's a guy now he was a visiting scholar at Calvin for a while, just a couple of months, and now he's in Oregon or Washington, who writes very much on religious issues. Pretty significant guy, and they had to get out. All right. Kirill himself is interesting. So I'll say some things about Kirill, and then I'll say and I'll say some things about another guy, Metropolitan Andrei Sheptypsky. Francis, the Pope of Rome, calls Kirill, as my Ukrainians would correct me, Kirill, Putin's altar boy. And as you know, he is a strong supporter of the invasion of Ukraine and what's known as the Ruski Mir, huh? The word mir means what here? Do you know what the word mir means? Comes from the Greek. Do you know? Huh? Peace. Very good. The Russian peace, right? The Russian peace. Yeah. All right. Yeah. You're very good. Very good. Lacey, right? All right. Yeah. The Russian peace. Exactly. I say that because one of my granddaughters' middle name is Demir, to give peace, huh? And she certainly does. As some of you know, during a sermon, this was just a year ago, amid protests and rising criticism over the Kremlin's recent announcement of partial mobilization to replenish Russian forces in Ukraine, Kirill told his followers, and I'm going to quote this, "Sacrifice in the course of carrying out your military duty washes away all sins." You're like that. Hey, you might consider changing. All right. Okay. All right. Tradition. That may have been an incentive I put for the Wagner mercenaries to engage in whatever, but it's going to wash away all your sins. All right. Okay. That's a comment. To escape punishment and prison. All right. Okay. They will not just escape prison in Russia, but they'll now escape eternal punishment. All right. Kirill previously claimed, and here, doing a heroic deed, quote, by killing Ukrainians, even as he urged them not to see Ukrainian people as enemies. All right. He said, you're not our enemies, but you can kill them. Now, that's Augustine said the same thing, right? Remember this? St. Augustine said, you can only kill your enemy if you love him. Or her, whatever. I mean, we'll say more about it. I have a handout for you on all that. The image here is that of faith and nation. No question about it. And I think there's some reasons for that. I don't want to go through this too much, but there is a concept in Eastern thought called symphonia, that church and state are bound together. We called it in the West Caesaropapism, where the state dominates the church. And it's not that. There's a great Armenian theologian, Vigan Goroyan, who argues this, and I think he's absolutely right, that what you have in symphonia is everything belongs to God, and everything belongs to God, then everything's under God, and there's no distinction between church, state, society. So there is some theological justification one might add but most Orthodox theologians, there's a neat statement you may find online done by Fordham's Center for Public Orthodoxy. Then say this is crazy, what Kirill is saying. All right. There is certainly a jihadist tendency in Moscow. And as I said, and I'm beginning to realize this, which is very hard to say, religion then can be toxic, not just to individuals, and it can be. I mean, I never understood why people leave the Christian tradition when I was young. As I get older and I see stories in people's lives and what happened to them in churches, I think, who am I? How can I make a judgment thinking that seems inconceivable to me, huh? You got faith and you should have kept it. But I mean, religion can be toxic in individual lives. It can be toxic to nations. One example is I use that Moscow patriarch priest, Mykola Yevtushenko, who pointed out to Putin's invaders, those in Bucha, which was a site of a great massacre, who would resist their takeover. So he said, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this grocery store owner, this one here. He pointed out to the invaders, these people are going to oppose your invasion. So immediately they were eliminated. There was a great piece on that on Frontline on the murder in Bucha when it came about, last year sometimes. Anyone's seen that? It shows you how bad it. I mean, you get these stories and think, oh my gosh. The Holy War tendency is not just true of Russia, not peculiar to Russia. Because during Vietnam, the fundamentalist preacher in the U.S. said that Yahweh was no pacifist, nor am I. Huh? God's no pacifist, nor am I going to be. Hitler's Germany had both the Deutsche Christian tradition and Pastor Mueller. At the same time, it had a counter voice. You had Dietrich Bonhoeffer, huh? And the Confessing Church. You have counter voices throughout this whole process. Nations are complicated, and there is a mixture there. I mean, I want to just say a little bit about this with Ukraine. In other words, is there such a thing as a pure ethnic Ukrainian? Huh? Well, they're mixed, right? All groups are mixed, I would suspect, to a large degree. I mean, whatever, if you've done Ancestry.com, you might find things that surprised you, right? Mine came out really accurate in terms of, and maybe because my family were immigrants. It was very clear to me. It came out very clear, but that's not true in every case. All right, Crimea, for example, was a Tartar place, right? And then they were deported under Stalin and they were killed. So territorial nations then oftentimes might be better seen in terms of places in which one comes into contact with others in community and builds solidarity and builds a certain sense of a public consciousness than just ethnic identity. That you kind of get what I'm saying? There's kind of a sense of a building of a civil society, all right? And that is what happened at Medan to a large degree. All these different people came together and they tried to build a civil society. That's an alternative vision. Snyder does some very good stuff on Medan, the Medan Revolution. Remember the context of that? What's Medan all about? Do you remember? Yanukovych. Yeah. Viktor Yanukovych was protested in Medan because he was put in by Putin. The election was rigged, right? I think there's no question about that. I mean, I tend to be pretty fair-minded, I think. As well as being opinionated, but pretty fair-minded. But the election was rigged, and then therefore you had a protest. I want us to look at what Snyder had to say about that in a minute. That might be helpful. The question. So, in other words, let me go here for a minute, and then I might. All right, let me do Medan for a minute. In November, this began in November 2013, all right? It began, if you know that one thing key in this whole thing, one thing I have to do is I have to get both a chronology and a geography map when I do this stuff. It isn't like American history, and I have to have a chronology, and there's some good chronologies online that'll give you the dates. Dates are important. I mean, I have a friend who's Ukrainian who gets things off by 300 or 400 years. And I joke with him. He probably has dementia too, but but be that as it may, I mean, he gets them off. Said, Michael, you're pretty good this one. You're only off 300 years. He confuses Nestor with the heretic Nestorius, and that Nestor, the writer of the Tale of Bygone Days. I said, Michael, no, you're only off by about that time was, and then maybe 600 years on that one. I don't know. All right. In any event, what you have in Maidan occurring is Yanukovych. And it begins early on in 2013. Annexation of Crimea is 214, in which supposedly Putin was online with Obama, and there was not going to be a real strong American backing up of Ukraine. But so even before that, you have this kind of. I remember I was in Lviv in 215, on the government dime, and I remember that when we went for training, everybody had to have, all the Americans had to have, and this is before the invasion. All the Americans had their suitcase pass all the time. So I lived in a collegium with students and other professors, and I had to have I had to have a bag ready, because we're getting out. The poor kids, Ukrainian kids, weren't getting out, but the Americans would be taken care of, as oftentimes is the case, right? We'd be getting out. So they told us, I think I might as well stay, because I don't know if I'd want to get on a bus trying to go into Poland, and into Krakow or not. It might be a disaster trying to get out of the country. But in other words, you have this kind of thing. Here's what Snyder says, historian. He begins an essay, Fascism, Russia, and Ukraine. The students were the first to protest against the regime of Viktor Yanukovych on the Maidan, the central square in Kiev, last November. Those were the Ukrainians with the most to lose. The young people unreflectively thought of themselves as Europeans and who wished for themselves a life in the Ukrainian homeland. Many of them were politically on the left, some of them radically so. I mean, that was one of the arguments, right? But I think the argument had to be made by Snyder, because people said that the protest was done by Western Greek Catholic Ukrainian Nazis. All right, and that seems to be like you. All right, okay, all right, like you. I mean, that the argument was basically these were a banderista. They were those Western Ukrainians who hate everything about community and solidarity and collectivism. But in any event, many of them. But I noticed my experience with students was they were ecstatic. They're ecstatic about it. After years of negotiations and once the promises, their government under Yanukovych had at last a moment failed to sign that major agreement with the European Union. Remember historically? All right. Ukrainians prefer the term, the Maidan protest of human dignity, rather than Euromaidan. I mean, Euromaidan was used early on, but that's really not what most people want. Later, veterans of the Afghan war joined the youth, who were not just their sons and daughters, but the hope of the nation. Actually, during the Afghanistan war, when Russia got out of that, when that war was engaged in by Russia, or then the Soviet Union, many of the people that were fought in that war were Ukrainians. So the Ukrainian war, and therefore, and I remember going to a cemetery near in the western part of Ukraine with one of my students, Ihor Medved, and we're looking at a guy. Said this was a friend of my dad's. His dad did the grave design. This was a friend of my dad's, and he died in Afghanistan. All right, so there are the arguments. Okay, the young and the old, Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Every Christian denomination is represented, and by their clergy.
The Crimean Tartars were there in impressive numbers, and Jewish leaders have a point of supporting the movement. Snyder says this: the diversity of Maidan is impressive. The group that monitors hospitals so that the regime cannot kidnap the wounded is run by young feminists. An important hotline that protesters call when they need staff is staffed by LGBT activists. So what you have together in Maidan is an alternative view to Kurils. You know, you have a certain sense of what we might call solidarity and the development of what we call a civic society. I think that's one of the things that Ukraine may offer us. I gave you more details. It presents a strong counter narrative that would counterbalance, I would say, individualism and fragmentation tendencies in Ukraine. And for me, is similar to the notion of the word solidarity. You know, solidarność in Poland, you call that, you know, you got this Lech Walesa and that whole story. So in many ways, there's a certain sense of solidarity, which is not totalitarianism or collectivism, but is you're in solidarity with people. And I remember the kids talking about after Maidan, because I knew some that were there. And they would say to me, you know, Dr. Abbott, you know, it's interesting. Now the people are kinder to each other on the marshutkas, or those buses. They're kinder to each other. It didn't last, by the way, they'd say. But immediately coming, that's another factor you find in Ukraine that you don't find maybe everywhere. I don't know if on buses, and everybody takes buses. Some people have cars, but not many. Yeah, but in any event, there's always that deference to us senior citizens. You know, do we do that here? And I don't know if we do that here. I don't ride enough buses, I guess. But there's always deference there, all complete deference. Okay, so it's an example of a counter balance to fragmentation. Sheptypsky is an interesting guy because he argues precisely for that. I'm going to be careful of time. I'm going to get out of here. Sheptypsky says, among other things, you know, love of nation's a good thing. He uses the commandment, honor your father and your mother in the land that God has given you. I could do the exact quote. All right. This paper.
Marco, we usually allow a few minutes for
we'll
questions.
Do that. Okay. But in any event, I think I apologize for being disjointed, but I did not want to read the text because I have 18 pages of text, which would be god awful. All right. Rather than just listening to me. All right. Any questions or thoughts? And I have a handout for you too that I prepared on, feel free to take one if you like. It's on different approaches in Christianity towards war and peace. It's something I did in actually Lviv in 2015. So feel free to everybody take one if you'd like. All right, questions, thoughts?
Has the war increased intention or popularity of religious activities in Ukraine?
That's a great question. Among people who are professional in that area, I'm talking mostly about clergy folks, right? They seem to sense that. One thing that's happening is that people are changing, in addition to what Catherine Warner says, this kind of just orthodox, there is among some people a real return to more serious practice. You know, the Ukrainians are really big about the dead and burying the dead. You know, 40 days after your funeral, you got this. You have a ceremony to honor the dead, and you pray for the dead. So that I think has really struck people. You know, that's just my experience, and there's a couple nice things done on YouTube. Some stuff on YouTube is crap, as you probably know. Hopefully, I use it mostly to do plumbing. But seriously, I mean, that and Ace Hardware, thank God. But there is some good stuff on it that shows the religion in Ukraine and how this has impacted people. It also produced the opposite. because you have a more of a kind of visceral negativity towards other Orthodox traditions. So you have people fighting all the time, right? But religion does that to people too, right? This may come as a shock to you people, but religion can bring out our best, I believe, and also bring out the worst in us too, right? Yeah, that's a good question, and I can't say much more than that. The people I know are interesting, though. The folks that I know over in Ukraine are, well, they're young, most of them, and they're young. And some are very good. Some are very serious about their faith, their Christian faith. I have a friend and his wife. They live in Leuven in Belgium, and they are very serious about it. Others, there's a young man I communicate with who's now in Poland. He and his girlfriend probably not, but she probably goes to church for Pascha, Easter, or the Nativity, and maybe other times. I don't know. Yeah. Good. Anything else? Yeah, sorry for talking at you for so long, but and it was half of what we were going to do, but that's all right. That's normal.
Do you have anything positive?
Yeah. And if you have any questions, I'll stay around too. Also, please feel free to.
I wonder if you have any positive statements about the role of religion in the war. I mean, it seems like
Well, it does. It
everything
can,
Russian
that's a
has
good.
done is
I think what it has done. I think what it has done is it this notion of solidarity and building of a civic society, and it's ecumenical. It's not kind of like you're in your silo and this one is other silo and we're going to hit each other. I mean, it's ecumenical. I think when you look at World War II, even in the American experience, people from different traditions came together, right? I mean, people were in the same combat unit, right? So you got a Baptist, and an Episcopalian in the same, group. I mean, I think that's happened. And I think, but again, the ones I read, and there's a great book by Sebchuk, two books I'd recommend as we're going. One is Sebchuk's book is an interview called "At the Foot of the Cross: Lessons from Ukraine," and he writes in here about what religion can do in post-war if that happens. The second book is one of my favorite writers. If I can find it, is Henry Nouwen's book on Genesis. It's called Ukraine Diocese or Ukraine Diary, like his Genesee Diary, if anyone's, I don't know if you're Nouwen fans, but he does a very interesting piece on what he found in religion in Ukraine. And I tend to be a Nouwen fan. I know some people find him to be too, whatever. They think and find he too liberal or too God loves you stuff, when I hear that stuff. All right, okay, all right. But I know that's, but I think his book on, this is basically his journal when he went to Ukraine a couple times. This is before the war. And this is in the 90s. And his brother does a commentary at the end, which is pretty interesting. And there's an introduction by Boris Gudziak, who is the Metropolitan Archbishop of Philadelphia, and with whom I've worked. Yeah. Turn this off or no? Okay, if I can.